morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this program. My name is Wilbert Mukori. Tonight I'd like to deal with Zimbabwe's finance minister, Ncubes' budget for the coming year. You read through it and you can't help but come to the conclusion that he's trying to prove once again that a nation can tax itself into prosperity, albeit prosperity of the few at the expense of the majority. The budget is meant to tax the poor and spare the rich. One of the things that Minister Ncube has come up with in his budget was this thing called Mansion Tax, in which he said that if somebody's house is worth US $100,000 or less, or more, then they will pay 1% of the value of the property as tax per year. Some of the poor people may think, well, I would not face that. I think this is just a slippery slope. We know how this regime works. Even as we speak, before the taxes even started, the regime would have started looking at how that threshold of $100,000 worth can be lowered, whilst at the same time, how other assets can be added on to that mansion value so that more and more people are caught up in this dragnet. Ultimately, I think we'll be looking at a situation here where somebody living in the mud hut will find themselves being told that they've got to pay tax. Their mud hovel has been upgraded to a mansion so that they can pay tax. This is not the first time the people of Zimbabwe have found themselves having to pay tax for a mud hut. What I've got there in the picture is a picture of a hut tax that was exerted by the white colonial regime. And this was a receipt for the 1902. The white colonial regime imposed taxes like that, including taxes on cattle, bicycles, donkeys, cats, dogs, you name it. But the primary purpose of the whites imposing those taxes was to force the blacks to seek work in the white-owned farms, white-owned mines and businesses so that they could pay their tax. Ncubes tax is meant to collect revenue. That's it. This regime has come up with all manner of taxes, and all of them have been to one end and purpose to increase the tax revenue for the regime. Meanwhile, of course, the filthy rich have found many ways of being exempted from the tax. The people of Zimbabwe know that the filthy rich hardly pay any tax in Zimbabwe. They've got ways of avoiding paying tax. The ruling elite themselves are known for importing posh cars, and they get tax exemption for their imports. Whereas the ordinary citizen, to import a second-hand vehicle, you may find yourself paying as much as 80% of the value of that vehicle in tax to bring it into the country. And yet, when these ministers and deputy ministers and well-connected individuals import Rolls-Royce, all manner of really expensive cars, you'll find that they don't pay any tax at all. They get tax exemption. The most worst case, of course, is the way the filthy rich have been looting the country's wealth. Those involved in the gold mine looting, the diamonds, you'll find that they get their mining concession weighted in such a way as the late Edward Chindoro Chininga found out. He died in 2012. He was the chairperson of the Parliamentary Committee on Mining. And because of his position, he was allowed to investigate what was happening in the Marange diamonds. And he found out that the mining concession that those people holding those concessions had been granted was weighted in such a way that they didn't have to declare the value of the diamonds they were getting, to whom they sold it, for how much, who shared in the proceeds. None of that information. And it was made for one purpose and one purpose only. They didn't have to declare their earnings. So the individual does not pay individual tax, and the company that he or she had employed to do the mining of the diamonds for him, the individual does not pay tax. The company that he's running does not have to pay tax. And so we have an industry worth billions of dollars and nobody's paying tax. And yet, the regime has been after taxing some of the poorest. Of course, everybody pays sales tax. When you go to the shop, you buy bread, there is sales tax there. Everybody pays that. This mansion tax is meant to be the additional tax on the individual. There are many people out there whose entire life, the one thing that they can say they've managed to keep is a house. Whilst if they are retired, for instance, their pension can hardly pay for their food And if they've got children who have got to go to school, education needs, healthcare needs for the family, clothing, and so forth. Some of the basic necessities. They have struggled. And if they live in the low density suburbs of the country, most of them will now find they now have got to pay this mansion tax. Because without any doubt, most of the low density houses will find they will be valued at more than 100,000 US dollars. And so they will have to find themselves paying 1,000 US dollars a year. Where would they get the money from? Where are they expected to get the money from? The pension they were getting, or the little income they're earning from being a vendor, will definitely not be able to afford them. They can hardly afford food right now and all the other basic necessities. And now they've got to take from that the equivalent of maybe 100 US dollars a month. Because to get it to 1,000, it's roughly you're looking at $100 a month, US. Where would they get it from? And yet the regime is determined to get a cut of that. So most of them will find that now themselves that they can't afford to stay in those houses anymore. And renting the houses is not an option either. Because even now, without this mansion tax, many people will finding it very difficult to pay their rent. And in this particular case, the rent has got to be at least 100 US dollars a month. Because you're not going to rent out your house and then have to find yourself subsidizing that just to pay the tax on the house. How many individuals out there can afford to pay 100 US dollars rent a month? And if that house is meant, if they have got to move out of that house to a lesser house, they have got to pay rent where they are as well. So the rent they are getting from their house in the low density suburb has got to cover the rent for the high density suburb house they are renting, and hopefully for some pay for some of their food and so forth and other needs, plus the tax they've got to pay for the house. This is just unbelievable. And yet the regime is going after them. And those who think they live in the high density suburbs, I believe that it will not be long before the regime finds ways of reaching them. And no doubt some of the rural homes will also find themselves paying some of this mansion tax. So even some of those mud brick houses, they may find themselves being upgraded to a mansion so that they pay the mansion tax. And all this for the sole purpose of saving the rich. In my group, my social media group, there's been taking the rounds a quotation of Winston Churchill, where he was basically saying that a nation cannot tax itself into prosperity. That would be the equivalent of somebody standing in a bucket and trying to lift themselves up. It's impossible. But what we see in a country like Zimbabwe is that that is very possible, because the regime is taxing the poor to save the rich. This is the tragedy in Zimbabwe. Every year, things have been getting worse and worse for the poor. In this case here, of course, the poor are told that Zimbabwe is making progress. Zimbabwe is getting rich, whereas in reality it is not. In fact, this issue of mass prosperity is something that Zimbabweans are well familiar with. Ever since the country's independence, we all know of Robert Mugabe's famous Kutsaruzhinji. Everybody was assured that ZANU-PF was going to deliver mass prosperity. He never got tired of Kutsaruzhinji. He repeated it over and over again. When Mnangagwa got into power following the military coup of 2017, he immediately promised that the country was going to prosper now. And his catchphrase was, Zimbabwe is open for business. But as we know, that didn't materialize. Because he also promised that he was going to stamp out corruption. And even more significantly, he promised he was going to hold free, fair, and credible elections. And when he failed to keep up those promises, nobody was fooled that Zimbabwe had changed. They could see that Zimbabwe had not changed. And so, well, the rich, the investors, the money, people with the money, made sure that they didn't come to Zimbabwe. So the flood of investors never materialized. It took 2 or 3 years for that reality to finally sink in. And Mnangagwa, of course, changed it. This time he was focusing on local investors, Zimbabweans themselves, and hence the birth of Nyika inovakwa nevene vayo. The irony of it is that that too was a lie. Zimbabwe government's own manpower requirement assessments have shown that the country has got a serious shortfall of skilled manpower in the areas of agriculture, engineering, healthcare, education, and so forth. The only area that has got a surplus of manpower is politics. Law. And there are so many pastors, it's unreal in Zimbabwe. Everybody is now a pastor. But clearly, none of those individuals are going to build Zimbabwe, as Mnangagwa promised. So this is just a way of assuring people that things are going to get better. And to refer back to Winston Churchill, that we can tax ourselves to prosperity. The poor are being taxed, and the rich are the ones who are getting the uplift. And the poor are being promised that tomorrow it will be their turn. They too will prosper. We already know of Mnangagwa's 2030 upper middle income status for Zimbabwe. All nonsense, of course. This new wave of taxes that the government has introduced is only going to catch even more and more people and drive them into poverty. And by rigging the 2023 elections, Mnangagwa is once again confirmed that Zimbabwe is very much a pariah state. Nobody's going to invest in Zimbabwe. Anybody who comes to Zimbabwe will always have one foot in the country, another foot out. They know the country is so unstable, you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. So you're always careful to make sure that you're not caught up in the system. It's a pity we keep going round and round in circles. I don't think Zimbabwe's economy is going to improve as long as we remain a pariah state. And the only sure way to get Zimbabwe out of this political and economic mess is by implementing the democratic reforms to ensure the country has got free, fair, and credible elections. That is the only way we're going to get out of this mess. Thank you very much for one of the listeners there giving their comments. Hard tax. What is hard tax? Well, like I said, this was the colonial days before even the UDI. The white regime realized that although they had the factories and farms and mines and so forth, the blacks were reluctant to work in those mines and factories and so forth. But by introducing some form of tax, they forced the blacks to leave their home to find work with the white employers so that they can earn the money to pay the tax. So it was a way of forcing the blacks to seek work for the whites. It wasn't really meant to generate wealth for the whites. No, that wasn't the primary purpose of these taxes. I remember as a child, you had to buy tax for the bicycle and your cattle. I can understand cattle being taxed because they had to use the dip tank, but I don't think given that was enough to pay for the expenses of the chemicals and so forth. But the main purpose, like I said, of the tax, and I think individuals too had to pay tax, was to force the blacks to seek work in the white-owned farms, mines, and so forth. So that was really the main purpose of the hard tax. But in this particular case, Ncube is introducing his own mad hard tax, and you know, and I think in time you'll find with some of these mud houses in the rural areas will be upgraded to mansion level, just for the purposes of paying tax. This regime is desperate for money, and it's not taxing the rich, so it has got to get it from someone. And taxing the poorest of the poor is probably the easiest target. So that is really the primary purpose of this tax. And like I said, the main reason why ZANU-PF is indulging in this is we are involved in this crazy idea of the nation taxing the poor to protect the rich, so that the rich become prosperous at the expense of the masses. So that is the way it is, and I don't think it's going to change. And I think some of the tax, actually, if you look at the budget itself, you find that the poor will not be saved. Like I said, one of the most direct taxes that everybody has got to pay is sales tax, and this toll tax that have gone up, and the cost of passports and so forth. Those affects everybody, including the poor. If you want a passport, they don't ask you, are you rich or poor? You still have to pay. And I think that the fee for the new passports have gone up to $200 or something like that. And toll tax, that everybody pays. They don't ask you whether you're poor or rich to pay poll tax. You pay fuel tax and so forth. So those are some of the taxes that affects everybody. And in this particular case, the poor are not being spared. But when it comes to this mansion tax, I think it's just a matter of time. The US $1,000 property will soon, you'll find that the dragnet will catch more and more people. And the regime needs to catch as many of the poor as possible, because, to be quite honest, the rich, they are not that many. And also the fact that the rich have got ways of avoiding tax, of being exempted from tax, to the point where they've got to raise the money somewhere else. And the somewhere else is among the poor. So, for instance, one of the things that they did also on this budget is some of the money that was being paid as COVID allowance, which was exempted from tax, now is being added as taxable income. So, and let's face it, some of those people, you find they are teachers whose salary is already very, very low anyway. And now they're finding themselves being asked to pay a bit more in tax. Or some of it would be pensionable income. In other words, they will take off from your salary as part of your pension. And how they spend that pension has always been questionable, because as we know, some of these pensions, the money has been used, and the pension itself, by the time you retire, is worthless because it was not invested properly. That is nothing new. And some of it has got to do with the hyperinflation. The pension you get, you are contributing now, and by the time you retire, because the Zimbabwe dollar has lost so much of its value, your pension is not even worth collecting. So there you are. And in this particular case, if you live in the low density suburb, and say, for instance, for the sake of argument, you were a teacher, yes, you would think now when you're working as a teacher, and if you're fully paid your mortgage, you can afford it. But if you're now relying on your pension alone, you find that your pension alone will not meet your basic needs. And then you find that if you're living in a low density suburb, you find you will have to pay this $1,000 per annum, this tax. I don't think many of the people who have on pension would be able to afford it, because their pension would not be worth that much. And if you're going to pay $1,000, that's $100 a month in tax. What about in the other needs? It really is going to be an impossible task. Anyway, with that, I would like to conclude this. So the main message here is that this budget proves once again that the nation can tax itself into prosperity, but only by taxing the poor to spare the rich. Whilst Winston Churchill said that because he was speaking as a Democrat, that it cannot be done, he was speaking as a Democrat. When you're not a Democrat like Mnangagwa, you don't have to be accountable to anybody. He has just rigged the August elections. He is not accountable to anybody. So he is able to tax the poor, tell them that they've got to wait for tomorrow, and they've been waiting for the last 43 years for their chance to get prosperous. Meanwhile, the ruling elite and their cronies are the only ones who are getting filthy rich. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you tomorrow, 6 o'clock. Thank you very much, and have a good evening.